So in our last lecture, I talked about the issue of co-founding and splitting equity. So now let's talk about one of the other R's in the three R's, and that is role dilemmas, right? What positions and what decision-making impacts are there? So role dilemmas, of all the dilemmas we talk about, these role dilemmas have the widest variety of approaches because they're affected by the widest number of factors. There's so many ways that co-founders can go right or wrong, and there's so many reasons why they normally go wrong, okay? So let's think about this for a minute. You remember the blogger company, Evan Williams and his friend Meg? They had different titles, but they basically had equal decision-making power. And any decision that required kind of a final say by anyone led to conflict, which eventually blew that team up. And that approach is what they call egalitarian. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then the same thing happened in ODO, right? When Evan was an advisor, and Noah was clearly the lead decision maker in that company. So Evan was happy to be an advisor, and then suddenly what happened? ODO took off, and then suddenly Evan's like, okay, well, I think I should be the CEO of this company at this point. So you have to be careful about the way these roles and responsibilities are assigned. So let's talk about executive titles. I mean, I find it sometimes funny that you see a company that started up by two people, and you have a CEO and a chief technology officer. Now, I will fall on the sword and tell you that I did the same thing when I was starting a company when I was much younger. I was the CEO, and my friend and my co-founder was the CTO. The difference in us, like I said earlier in an earlier lecture, we knew each other very well. My background basically pushed me to be the CEO. I had a financial background. I raised money. I had, business acumen. He was a brilliant technologist, so chief technology officer. But the point of this is these titles get taken very seriously by many people. And which person in the organization gets the title is sometimes very difficult negotiation. It wasn't in my case, but it can be a difficult decision for co-founders. Some founders don't even like to be called the CEO. Like, for example, if you have a scientific company and you have a scientific founder, that person may be called chief scientific officer, or if you're a technical company, perhaps chief technology officer. The problem with these executive titles is that once the negotiation's over, the co-founders in the organization who are not the CEO feel like, oh, well, I'm the lesser founder in this deal, which is not the case, but that's how sometimes they feel, okay? So as I had mentioned in one of my earlier lectures, the number of co-founders in most companies were between 2 and 3. And here's some data that shows like how top-heavy is a company when companies have 2 or 3 co-founders. And you may not be surprised to see that the C-level employees in 2 founder companies are almost 70% of the total number of people in the organization. And in 3 founder companies, they're actually over 70%. So it's a problem that exists. We recognize that. And I think you have to understand that, sometimes maybe instead of calling yourself the CEO and the CTO, maybe you should just say, I'm a founder. My title is founder. And until you decide, kind of what roles you really will assume in the longer term, that may be a solution. So who gets them? Basically, it depends upon the level of commitment. Think about Zipcar, the Zipcar case we talked about. Robin Givens, was the person who was the CEO, but her co-founder, she had no commitment whatsoever. So what title did she get? And the question is, which founder is the kind of idea person? Who came up with the idea? Again, Zipcar, it was Robin. So she logically would get the executive title. And it also depends upon what type of human capital, social capital, financial capital you have. The more you have, the more likely you would get an executive title. Okay, so let's look now at the division of labor versus overlapping roles, okay? So, and compare, the and contrast, the strengths and weaknesses of these things. So if you and your co-founders are in positions where your roles essentially overlap, then the strength of that is that you have some flexibility. People can pitch in wherever they need, where the help is needed, and you have this collective knowledge among the group, right? The weaknesses of this overlapping role type of division is that who's responsible for the decision? It weakens the incentives that come out of that type of situation, because nobody knows who's actually made that ultimate decision. And you want to, minimize redundancy. If you have overlapping roles, you basically are doing a lot of the same stuff. And when you're starting a company out, you really want to have people with different skill sets. So you want to try to minimize redundancy in the company when you're first starting. And of course, there can be some tension involved. We'll talk about the tension here in just a minute. So division of labor, which everybody is specifically assigned a task and everybody knows who's doing what, no overlapping roles. So the strengths of that is that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. So therefore, when something goes wrong, we know whose fault it was, basically. And you try to fit the assignment of tasks to the founder's strengths, okay? On the negative side, when you have division of labor, that tends to reduce the collaborative environment in an organization, and that's never a good thing, and particularly in an early stage company. And you may have assigned people tasks for which they're not fully capable of working, and that's suboptimal. So, there's strengths and weaknesses of both of these different styles. And let's talk about this a little bit more. So the decision-making approaches, we give them a name, right? The overlapping roles, what we talked about a minute ago, we call that egalitarian, where everything's done on consensus, right? You ignore titles, you make decisions based upon consensus, everybody's, unequal. Okay, good, everybody's happy, right? Everything works perfectly. Then you have the division of labor, the hierarchical autocratic approach, where you have formal processes, you have a clear hierarchy about who's doing what, and you have one single person who's responsible for the ultimate decision in the company. Normally, it would be the CEO. Okay, so let's talk about egalitarianism, okay? When do people use an egalitarian approach? Well, normally when they have similar backgrounds, right? Or you haven't decided who's going to be the CEO. So, okay, there's no CEO, so we'll all work on this together. The problem with using egalitarianism is that it takes a long time to get to a decision because you're doing it as a collective group, and you don't need slow decisions in a high-velocity company because, early-stage companies need decisions to be made, quickly. Egalitarian approaches take a long time, and, people tend to be much less decisive. So veteran entrepreneurs who've done this more than once will always say, oh, you should never follow an egalitarian approach when you're putting together your co-founding team. But believe it or not, most teams still choose that egalitarian approach in the very beginnings of the company. On the other side, let's compare this to the egalitarianism to the hierarchical approach, right? The advantage of this consensus approach is you build trust among your co-founders, right? Everybody's being treated equally, so that's a positive thing. But if you look at the hierarchical approach, you can quickly mobilize resources, and there's clear accountability. So that's a very plus for using the hierarchical approach. The disadvantages of egalitarianism is it takes a long time, as I said earlier. Particularly problematic if your company is in a high-velocity environment and there's much less accountability. Whereas in the hierarchical approach, the disadvantages is it's difficult to process these complex environments by only one person. If one person's assigned the task, sometimes that's a difficult thing to do. So input from multiple people with specialized knowledge is always going to lead to a better decision. Okay, so how do you avoid conflict in assigning roles to people, right? You want to avoid conflict. You want to, don't underestimate what we call title inertia. That means somebody's named, let's say, Chief Technology Officer, and what they really are is a pretty good software developer. And they don't, their title doesn't really tell what their true capabilities are. So it's been inflated to the point where they really cannot handle the role that for example, a Chief Technology Officer would be required to do. And then some other things to avoid when you talk about assigning roles is, if one of your co-founders is really big on having someone on the board of directors, if you have a board at that point, which I would suggest that most companies should form a board, hopefully some independent people on that board. If one of the co-founders wants an ally on that board, meaning one of their people, that can be a danger sign. So just keep an eye out for that. Okay. So anyway, those are just some ideas about how do you avoid conflict when you're assigning roles to people.